All right, welcome back. The first half of this video is going to be sort of a review from what we did last lesson, and that's on conditional statements. Remember, conditional statement, this should be something that is in your memory now, should be secondhand to you. You should be able to tell me what a conditional statement is. If you don't know what a conditional statement is, look through your notes, make sure you have that memorized. And hopefully you recall that a conditional statement is an if-then statement. And the conditional statement has a hypothesis and a conclusion. Remember, your hypothesis is your P, your conclusion is your Q. All right, so in the following problems, let's identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. So we want to identify our P and our Q. So we're going to underline the hypothesis and then circle the conclusion. If necessary, you want to write the sentence as a conditional in if-then form. So the first example is all athletic or Olympic competitors are athletes. Now, in order to identify the hypothesis and circle the conclusion, we're going to have to put this in if-then form. So take a second and figure out how we can make this sentence make sense in if-then form. And hopefully you came up with something like this. If someone is an Olympic competitor, then he or she is an athlete. And just make sure that what you wrote makes sense and is true. In order to be in the Olympics, you have to be an athlete, so that is true. If you had written it the other way, if someone is an athlete, then he or she is an Olympic competitor, that's not necessarily true, so we don't write it that way. Okay, so we're going to underline our hypothesis. Remember, the hypothesis follows the if, so that's going to be someone that is an Olympic competitor. And we're going to circle our conclusion. Remember, the conclusion is what follows the word then, and it would be he or she is an athlete. Okay, just for a little bit of extra practice, I'm not going to go in depth with this example. Go ahead and figure out example B. We want to circle the hypothesis and underline the hypothesis and circle the conclusion. And we should have this as your answer. Okay, let's review using symbols for our conditional statements. Remember, the hypothesis is going to be represented by a P. The conclusion will be represented by a Q. And we write this arrow in so that it reads if P, then Q. That's what the arrow reads. So in symbolic form, we have P, arrow, Q. Okay, what if we only negate the conclusion? So here it says we are good, it's still going to say we are good, right? We're just going to negate the conclusion. So instead of saying we will get ice cream, we're going to say we will not get ice cream. Remember that word negate? It means to take the opposite of. So in symbolic form, it's still our conclusion, but it's been negated. So we have that tilde, or that little squiggly mark. So we write this as P arrow opposite of Q. So that reads if P, then, it's an arrow, sorry, then the opposite of Q. Okay, now we're going to go through 3 different scenarios that we can play on a conditional statement, and these are very, very important. You want to have these in your notes, highlighted, starred, whatever it takes. There's 3 words you're going to need to know and have them memorized and completely committed to your brains. It's going to be your converse, your inverse, and your contrapositive. So let's go ahead and start with the converse of a conditional. Okay, the converse of a conditional, remember your conditional is P then Q. Converse just means to flip the conditional statement. So instead of reading P then Q, it's going to read Q then P. Okay, so the steps in writing the converse of a conditional is to identify your hypothesis and conclusion. So we've already done that by establishing the hypothesis will be your P and the conclusion will be your Q. And then we are going to, hopefully you can read this, we're going to flip or switch the position of the hypothesis and the conclusion so that it reads Q then P, or if Q then P. This is the part that you really need to have in your notes. The converse is read if Q then P, or have this flip the hypothesis and the conclusion. All right, how will you remember this? Now, when you have definitions stored away in your brain, they all kind of get mumbled and jumbled together. So the way I remember the definition of Converse is I think about, the shoe, Converse shoe, and I think about how you can do a backflip in the Converse shoes. So when you're wearing your Converse shoes, you can do a backflip. So if you can remember Converse shoes, flip. That will tell you that you're going to flip the P and the Q. Okay, so make sure that you have the definition of Converse in your notes in some way that you're going to remember it. If my way doesn't work for you, if you have no clue what a Converse shoe is and you know what you say, there's no way I'm going to remember to flip in my Converse shoes, then come up with something, because these definitions are going to start to kind of mold together, and it's hard to keep them organized what they are. So let's go ahead and apply this definition. For example, we have if we are good, so being good is going to be our hypothesis, then we will get ice cream. Now, they don't have to write the word then. Remember, that's your job. If you're not given an if-then statement, you have to know when the then is going to come in, or how to manipulate the statement into a conditional in order to do the converse of it, or inverse, or whatever we're about to do. So we have to know that there should be a then there, and the conclusion is we will get ice cream. So the symbolic form of this, and that's always your symbolic form of your original conditional, is going to be if P then Q. So to take the converse of that, we want it to read if Q then P. We're going to flip it. We're going to flip in our Converse shoes. So go ahead and take a second and flip this original conditional. Okay? And you should have had something like this. If we will get ice cream, then we are good. So make sure that it's the hypothesis and the conclusion have been flipped. Okay, the next definition that you're going to need to know is the inverse of a conditional. This needs to be in your notes. We need to know the definition of an inverse. So the same thing applies. To write the inverse of a conditional, you have to identify your hypothesis and your conclusion. Then once you've done that, the inverse is going to be negating your hypothesis and then negating your conclusion. So the hypothesis and the conclusion stay in the same spot, but we're going to take the opposite of both the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if you want to abbreviate your steps like this, go right ahead, but make sure you know that it means to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion. So I'm also going to give you the formal steps of how to do it. Okay, so here's the steps if you want to write that in a nice formal way. We want to negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. All right, now how are you going to remember this? There's a couple ways that I remember it so I don't get my inverse and my converse confused. Remember, converse, we're doing a backflip in our Converse shoes. But an inverse, the way I remember it, is the first two letters of inverse tell you what to do. Ask yourself the question, what do? I negate. See how the first two letters tell you what to do? I negate. So you negate the hypothesis and you negate the conclusion. Another way that you can remember it, or that I've heard people remember it, is when they hear the word in, they automatically think of the opposite of in, which is out. So it's kind of like a word association. When I hear in, I think out. I think opposites. Opposite of in is out. So you're taking the opposite of the hypothesis and the opposite of the conclusion. So whichever of those two work for you, or if you have your own suggestion, write that down. But make sure you have a way to remember it so you don't get the words confused. Okay, so go ahead and look at this example here and take the inverse of if we are good, we will get ice cream. So we have identified that we are good as your hypothesis, that's your P. We will get ice cream, that's your Q. So we want to take the inverse of this, or we want to negate our P and then negate our Q. So take a second and write down your response. And you should have had, if we are not good, then we will not get ice cream. Or remember, to negate something means to take the opposite of. So the opposite of being good is being bad. So if you just wrote, if we are bad, then we will not get ice cream. That is completely acceptable, and I applaud you for thinking outside the box. Okay, and finally, your last definition that you want to have in your notes is going to be the contrapositive. And the contrapositive is a combination of the converse plus the inverse. Okay, you're going to negate your original conditional and you're going to flip your original conditional. So the steps are the same. You still want to identify your hypothesis and your conclusion, and then you want to flip that hypothesis and conclusion, and you want to negate them as well. So you want to put that little tilde in front of there. So if you want to write your notes like this, that's fine, but I'm going to give you the formal notes in just a second. Okay, so here's the formal steps if you like to have them, all written out. Identify the hypothesis and conclusion, and then flip and negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. Now for how will I remember this? I've been teaching geometry for going on 4 years now, and I have yet to have anybody give me anything that has stuck for how to remember contrapositive, except that contrapositive is the biggest, longest word of the three, and that means we do the most stuff to it. So contrapositive has the most letters, so we're going to do the most stuff to it. We're going to converse it and inverse it. We're going to flip it and negate the conditional. If you can come up with a better idea for how to remember this one, please let me know. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. Remember, our original conditional is always if P then Q. So that's still our hypothesis. This is still our conclusion. So let's go ahead and take the contrapositive of that. So we want to flip our hypothesis and our conclusion and negate our hypothesis and our conclusion. So take a second and write down what you would put for the contrapositive of this conditional. And you should have had, if we will not get ice cream, so that's the opposite of getting ice cream, then we are bad or not good. The opposite of not good, or the opposite of good, is going to be bad. So we're flipping that hypothesis and conclusion, and we're negating it. Okay, so now that we have all of our definitions down and we've applied each one of them, I want you to take a second to figure out what the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of this original conditional is. Go ahead and pause the video because I'm going to pop all the answers up at one time. Okay, so for your converse, you should have had, if a polygon has 4 sides, then it is a quadrilateral. We have flipped our hypothesis and conclusion. If you wrote the word it, if you said if it has 4 sides, then the polygon is a quadrilateral, that is wrong. We do not speak like that. That's not proper English. It doesn't make sense. That's not how the syntax of our sentences go. So if you wrote if it has 4 sides, then the polygon is a quadrilateral, that is going to be marked wrong. Okay, for the inverse, we just had to put a not or no in front of in front of the word is here. And we just had to put a not or no in front of has here. So if a polygon is not a quadrilateral, then it does not have 4 sides. We're just negating our P, negating our Q. Sorry about that. Every now and then we have the dogs making a grand appearance in the videos. All right, and then finally for our contrapositive, we're flipping our P and Q, and then we're negating it. So remember, if you wrote, if it does not have 4 sides, then the polygon is not a quadrilateral. That is going to be marked wrong. We have to identify in our opening sentence, opening statement, what it is. It's not proper English to say if it is if it has 4 sides or does not have 4 sides. We always start with introducing our subject. If a polygon does not have 4 sides. Remember, the polygon is not P. The fact that something is a quadrilateral, that is our P. Okay? So when you're identifying your hypothesis and how to flip it or negate it or whatever, it's not the polygon that gives it a P. It's the quadrilateral. Anything to do with being a quadrilateral is your P. Okay, so if you had these answers, go ahead and work on this next example right here. Now write the converse of the conditional statement and then decide if it's still true. Okay, if it's false, we're going to give a counterexample. Remember that word counterexample, when you prove something false by giving an example of why it's false. So go ahead and find the converse of this and then tell me if it's true or false, and if it's false, I need a counterexample. So pause the video and take a minute to figure those out. Okay, so first let's address the converse. Remember converse, we can flip in our converse shoes, so we flip the P and the Q. So a number being divisible by 10, that's our P. A number being divisible by 5, that's our Q. So we're going to flip that so that it reads Q then P. So you should have, if a number is divisible by 5, then it is divisible by 10. If you wrote, once again, if you wrote, if it is divisible by 5, then a number is divisible by 10, once again, that will be marked incorrect. We do not speak like that. We always introduce our subject as we start our sentence. So the number is divisible by 5, then it is also divisible by 10. Now, hopefully, we said false. Okay? So my counterexample is going to be the number 5. That's what I would write for my counterexample. Why is that? Okay, we got to find out if a number is divisible by 5. So 5 is divisible by 5. Remember, divisible means it goes into evenly without a remainder. Then it is also divisible by 10. Well, 5 divided by 10 gives us 1/2. That is not divisible by 10. You also could have said 15, could have said 25. Anything that you divide 10 by that gives you a remainder, or divide by 10 that gives you a remainder, is going to be a counterexample. Okay, and the last definition that you need to know, it's not really dealing with the conditional. We're not manipulating the conditional, but we're actually going to combine a conditional and its converse. So if you have a conditional and its converse that are both true, we combine them into a biconditional. So don't worry about writing anything right now. Let's just talk about what it is, and then I'll let you know when you should have your definition down. So let's take a look at this conditional. If a polygon is a quadrilateral, then it has 4 sides. Okay, polygon, that's a quadrilateral. Definition of a quadrilateral is this quad here, polygon with 4 sides. So this is a true conditional. All right, now let's take the converse of that. So we're going to flip that. So we want, if a polygon has 4 sides, remember we don't just say it. If a polygon has 4 sides, then it is a quadrilateral. Okay, so let's talk about that. A polygon with 4 sides, the definition of a polygon with 4 sides, or sorry, the term for a polygon with 4 sides is a quadrilateral. So this is also true. When these are both true, you can combine them into a biconditional. Okay, the biconditional is going to be an if and only if statement. Okay, and it's also going to have an arrow that goes both ways. So a biconditional is going to combine your original hypothesis without the if. So a polygon is a quadrilateral. And then it's going to say if and only if it has 4 sides. So let me show you how you write it. Then I'll explain the definition, and then I'll show you in symbolic form. Okay, so a polygon is a quadrilateral. IFF, it has 4 sides. This IFF means if and only if. If you want to write out if and only if, that's fine, but we abbreviate it like this. Okay, the symbolic form of a biconditional, and this is probably what you really want to have, is P double arrow Q. That double arrow reads if and only if. So P, if and only if, Q. So hypothesis, a polygon is a quadrilateral. If and only if, conclusion, it has four sides. So the definition of a biconditional is going to be combining the converse, or it's going to be combining the hypothesis and the conclusion with an if and only if. Okay, so your formal definition that you're going to want to have is combining the hypothesis and the conclusion of a conditional with if and only if, when both the conditional and its converse are true. So it's a real long definition, and it's going to be hard, one of those hard ones to remember. But just remember the keywords if and only if. So you keep your hypothesis, add an if and only if, and you keep your conclusion. Okay, so here's a look ahead at what you're going to be doing. Your next step is to work on the practice that follows this lesson of conditionals and biconditionals. Remember to look out for the problems with asterisks by them. Those are the ones that are going to go along with a video for worked out solutions if you get stuck. After you have watched the video and done the practice, you're going to take your exit ticket, your exit quiz on conditionals and biconditionals. Remember, you have to score above an 80% in order to move on to the next thing. The next thing is going to be a little bit different now. We have a quiz coming up, an actual paper pencil quiz that you're going to take without your notes, without your lesson viewing device, whether it's an iPad or a computer or a tablet or whatever you're using. And you have to take that quiz and score a 90% or better. Now, the reason this is going to be hard is because you've been able to use your notes on your exit tickets and your exit quizzes and your practice worksheets. You have to have those definitions memorized. Every definition that we've gone over, everything that I've starred and said this definition must be memorized, you have to have memorized. So when you do this quiz review right here, do it without your notes and then see how you do. Because if you can't score a 90% or better on the quiz review, you will not score 90% or better on the quiz. If you don't score 90% or better on the quiz, you've got to do the quiz review in full without notes anyway, turn that in for a grade. So it's just easier if you just do the quiz review, get help from your peers, ask questions, review the video, and then take your quiz. All right, I'll see you next time.